guys, so on to the end of World War I officially being over with the Treaty of Versailles. Okay, so after World War I, a lot of these different nations were really struggling to rebuild. You had that global depression in the 1930s, which led to a high unemployment and a really just strong sense of desperation in Europe. People really needed answers. And a lot of those problems are going to create a real big bitterness with this thing known as the Treaty of Versailles. Okay, so as you know from when we talked about World War I, it was fought between the Allies and the Central Powers from 1914 to 1918. And on November 11, 1918, the German government agreed to this armistice and the end of World War I happened. Okay, so World War I, again, we've seen a lot of really kind of gross pictures on here. It was the largest, the most deadly, and the most destructive war the world has ever seen. At the end of the war, you had about 8.5 million soldiers and 13 million civilians die as a result of the war. You also had 21 million that were wounded during the war. You also had a lot of mental disorders come about. For the first time, the radical new idea of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, came about. People started to believe, okay, after someone comes home, after seeing all these traumatic experiences, it can have an effect on them. And mental disorders started to be really focused on. And people started to believe, yeah, people can have really traumatic experiences that will just hurt them for the rest of their life if they're not being treated properly. And people started to really recognize that. After the war, a lot of homes, farms, and towns were destroyed. The war eventually going to cost a total of $338 billion. And most of the national treasuries were empty, so everyone's broke. Your whole entire countries are destroyed. And some of these countries still are impacted by all of this stuff today. So in 1919, after the war, different representatives from these different nations attended this thing known as the Paris Peace Conference, just to write a treaty to officially end the war. And this conference was led by the Big Four nations: Britain, France, Italy, and the United States. Now, one thing to mention on here, and this is what's going to create a lot of tensions that you'll notice in World War II, neither Germany or any of the Central Powers, none of the losers of the war, were allowed to attend. Now, Russia also couldn't attend because they had already quit World War I, but it's very significant to know that this meeting to decide what's going to happen after the war, the people who lost were not allowed to be part of that. And that's really going to upset them in the years after this treaty. So creating a treaty to try to end the war wouldn't be that easy because a lot of these powers had a lot of different agendas. So for instance, Britain and France, they wanted to weaken Germany so it could never go to war again. And also Britain and France wanted Germany to pay full blame, pay all the reparations, and lose all their overseas colonies. So Britain and France were like, no mercy. Germany, we're going to punish you as hard as we possibly can. Meanwhile, though, the U.S. said, let's not punish them as hard as we possibly can because you never know. In 20 years, they might go back to war with us. Maybe we should have listened to the United States. Maybe we would not have had a little thing called World War II later on. But, you know, like the U.S. President, Woodrow Wilson, disagreed with these harsh punishments. He said, no, we don't need to do that. So Wilson's going to present his own peace proposal, and that's going to be known as the 14 points. And these 14 points are 14 things Wilson says should happen as a result of the war. Okay? So one of the things that he did, he wanted to give all nations an opportunity to work out their grievances without resorting to war. So do something more peaceful. And Wilson really hoped by creating this thing known as the League of Nations, where a group of countries could meet together and peacefully talk out what should happen, that could peacefully negotiate solutions to future conflicts. So if anything else like this happens again in the future, where you have a group of people wanting their independence from a country, all of these different countries around the world could meet as a group and say, hey, here's what we could do. Let's come up with a solution. League of Nations, we'll talk about later on, isn't going to actually work out in the end. It's going to be replaced by this thing known as the United Nations. Okay, so the League of Nations is basically a continuation of the United Nations, where people meet from these different countries to negotiate peace when there's conflict in other countries. And it's kind of cool because, again, I'm the sponsor for the Model United Nations Club we have at Parkview, so I think all of this stuff's really fascinating. But it started with the League of Nations, which is eventually not going to work out. So a lot of these different 14 points that Woodrow Wilson has, his idea of let's not punish them as harshly as Britain and France wants, they're going to really disagree. So they have to come to some sort of a compromise. Because the British and France are like, man, Woodrow Wilson, you're a little too soft on these guys. They went to war with us. You don't even know. And Wilson's like, well, I don't understand the problem. Like, let's not like punish them. They're going to fight us in 20 years, and then y'all are going to be sorry. But they have to come sort of a compromise, and that compromise is going to be known as the Treaty of Versailles, where they officially end the war. here's what they do in this treaty. Okay, so for one, they do have the League of Nations, Woodrow Wilson wanted, and it would serve as an international organization to keep peace among nations. That league would also include a court of international justice to settle disagreements. So let's say a couple countries over here are fighting against a couple countries over here. Well, we're just going to have a whole court to decide how to fix that problem. So rather than go to war, we'll just talk it out, have a court decision. Also, this league is going to include an agreement that all members of these nations would work together to stop future acts of aggression. So if you join the League of Nations, you have to say, I am going to do my best to try to not fight and have a war with these people. They do the same thing in the United Nations. Right now, the United States is a member of the United Nations, and it's basically saying, as a member of these United Nations, I am going to do my best not to attack you. Okay, doesn't always work out, but that's the goal. Okay, so here's what they do in the treaty. So number one, Germany had to give up all lands in Europe and all of its overseas colonies. So any areas that it owned that wasn't specifically part of Germany before the war, they had to get rid of. Number two, they were forced to sign the War Guilt Clause, where they would accept all blame for the war and pay $33 billion in reparations to the Allies. And number three, the German military was reduced to only 100,000 troops, 6 warships, no submarines, and could not manufacture war equipment. Now, a lot of this stuff, that's harsh. That's a lot. And the Germans are not going to exactly be excited about that. So these mandates gave Britain and France control over all oil resources in the Middle East, so a lot more power to Britain and France. The Ottoman Empire officially going to be destroyed as a result of the treaty. Britain and France are going to be given mandates in the Middle East, so the British and the French are going to take over even more areas, more imperialism, yay, in the Middle East now. Central Europe's going to be redrawn to reduce the power of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, so even though Austria-Hungary really is what started the war, they don't get as much except for less power and less land. Land's going to be taken from Germany to create Poland. Poland didn't exist until the end of World War I. Wow. And a lot of that land used to be German. So when we get to World War II and Germany takes over Poland, it's a huge deal because Poland was once part of Germany before it was created after World War I. Also, the border between Germany and France is going to be demilitarized to avoid a future invasion, so the Germans cannot have a military along the border with France. And then also, new nations are going to be created from territories Russia gave up when it left the war early. So Russia had to give up some areas, so a lot of Eastern Europe is going to create a lot of new countries that we'll hear about more in World War II. So on June 28, 1919, Germany and the major Allied powers officially signed this treaty, and World War I officially came to an end. And while most nations celebrated the official end of World War I, Germans really protested those harsh terms because, again, Britain and France didn't really listen to Wilson and his 14 points and were a lot harsher than Wilson wanted them to be. And that's going to create a lot of problems where the Germans are going to say, down with the brutal peace, this isn't fair. And that anger is going to continue on for about 20 years until this one guy who was leading some of that anger against the Treaty of Versailles rises up, has a weird little mustache, and names himself dictator of Germany, known as Adolf Hitler. And we'll get to him later on. But World War I overall, though, was the largest war the world had ever seen. It really changed the way that future wars were fought. And again, part of the way that it was so impactful was these nations used that sense of total war to commit all their resources to winning by using drafted soldiers, rationing, and propaganda. You also had those new war technologies that really increased the rate of death and destruction to unprecedented levels. More people died in World War I than in any world before. And also, the war really changed expectations for women, and it led to a lot of voting rights for women in many different nations. It was the largest war the world had ever seen. It changed the way future wars were fought. In the end of the war, you had about 22 million soldiers and civilians die, and an entire generation of Europeans, for the most part, was killed off. You also had a lot of destruction throughout Europe, and the war devastated the economies of European nations, and that's what led to the Depression. And the Versailles Treaty, overall, though, it caused a lot of problems and bitterness in nations, particularly in Germany. The Treaty of Versailles has also been nicknamed as the peace built on quicksand, and it didn't really address those main causes of World War I, militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. And the League of Nations, in the end, even though Wilson created the League of Nations, the U.S. created it, the U.S. actually didn't join the League of Nations. And the leaders of it would do anything to avoid another war, but it wasn't that successful. And we'll talk about why later on. But a lot of that high employment and desire for revenge is going to lead to these really aggressive dictators that are going to rise up in the end of the 1920s and 1930s. in this climate of post-war uncertainty, a lot of nationalism is going to increase, and citizens are going to turn to these totalitarian dictators to rule the nation. And we'll get into all of that stuff in our next video. But I'll talk to you guys next time. Bye!